Nicholson, as I mentioned, is a partner at Kensington Swan. Many of you would have heard him speak before. We've asked him to come because he's a good speaker and he speaks really well about this subject. He's a very renowned lawyer in the health and safety space in New Zealand and is really leading the discussion on what this new law will mean for New Zealand businesses. So without any more, Grant, welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. You'll be pleased to know I've been given literally 10 minutes to tell you everything there is to know about the new law, so you can forget about that. Basically, let's make it work. There we go. There's a lot of law change going on, and I'm not really going to try to actually give you anything of substance about it today, but the question that's been posed for you in the agenda is, why should you care about all these changes? And for me, picking up what Gillian's been saying to you, it's really about opportunity. The reality is our safety record is appalling. The law is changing, trying to make that better, but compliance is not going to be enough. You can all go away and try to implement that new law in your organisations in a skinny way that will meet the expectations of WorkSafe, but it's not going to achieve the forum's goal of zero harm. It's really about actually showing your leadership and seeing what we can do to actually make New Zealand safer. Up there on the screen, obviously some of the key changes. We're going to have repeal of the Health and Safety and Employment Act. We're going to have a new Health and Safety at Work Act. Gordon McDonald can speak as to when we might expect that. It's due at the moment for 1 April. I think that's unlikely. Maybe 1 July might be more realistic, but hopefully Gordon can enlighten all of us. That isn't the end of it though. There's also going to be a whole heap of new codes of practices, new sets of regulations, new guidelines coming out from WorkSafe, trying to actually give you all some clues about what is expected of your organisations to meet the challenges of these new law. One of the lessons we got out of Pike River really was having a general standard law without clear guidance and rules didn't work in that particular sector. We've seen a lot of changes already with mining now actually telling us, particularly for mining companies, what you have to do, how you have to do it. That's going to be rolled out across a whole range of industries. So there's ongoing change, and really just sort of watch this space. WorkSafe will populate a lot of that. They'll be telling us what's going on. But there's a wide range of regulations. I mean, even when the new Act comes in, there'll be 5 new sets of regulations covering things like your worker engagement. What are you actually going to have to do to interact with your health and safety representatives, with your health and safety committees? What are you going to do with some of these new obligations that your organisations are going to face? Right through to things like actually dealing with hazardous substances, hazardous work, what do you have to do with that? So within your organisations, you need to be thinking about who's going to be responsible for understanding what these requirements are and what you can do with them. Now, in terms of substantive things to try to talk about for you today, I thought just pick up a couple of points that come out of the new law and really just try to give you a sense as what are some things you can be thinking about. The first one is this wonderful new term, PCBUs. The Australians call that peekaboos. Do all of you know what that is, a PCBU? Lots of nodding heads, that's good. So a person conducting a business or undertaking. That's going to be your business organisation. Commonly that'll be a company. It might be a partnership. And for some of the SME businesses that you might interact with, it'll actually be down to individuals doing their work. The point I thought might be worth making for you though this afternoon, just to think about the scope of that is, it's easy to think of it at a group level and just think, we're, say Fletcher Building, we're one organisation. Well, that's fine, except the Fletcher Building consists of something like 50 companies, and they're each individually going to be a PCBU, and they're each going to have obligations in relation to their own specific part of that business. But at a group level, and for all of you, you need to be thinking about, well, what oversight do we have on those particular group companies, particularly if you've got really different operating divisions who maybe don't have a lot of interaction with each other. Because in Australia, we're currently seeing the first prosecution of an officer under their new version of the law that we're getting. And that officer isn't actually even a director of the company who has the worker who was hurt. It's an associated company within the same group. And they're looking to blur that distinction within a group structure about who might be the PCBU. I've seen that happen here in New Zealand under the existing law, where a business had a contract to supply some workers, and it was a different group company who were using those workers, and somebody was hurt. And it was the one using the workers who was prosecuted even though they didn't have a contract. So just be aware that there's going to be some blurring around some of that stuff. Workers, one of the great changes of this new law, the next one to talk about, just recognising that that's now going to be everybody. You aren't just going to be hung up on whether people are your employees, whether you've got a direct contract with a contractor, but accepting that actually everybody who comes into contact with your workplace and your workers is somebody that you've now got some responsibility for. I think that's actually a great opportunity for all of you to demonstrate some leadership, because there's far too many businesses who I come into contact with, generally speaking when something's gone wrong, where they haven't properly thought through what the consequences of work were going to be for some of those contractors or subcontractors, what influence they could exert over the projects where people were going in, and actually taking care of those people to make sure that they went home at the end of the day. This new law is going to really require you to think really widely about who are the workers, who you all have influence over, people coming into contact with your organisations and what you can do about that. Third one, just to touch on for you, is this idea of so far as is reasonably practicable. And you have to love the politicians, because we've gone from all practicable steps that hopefully most of you know is the current standard, and that doesn't really mean all practicable steps, it means all reasonably practicable steps. So now we've changed it, because why wouldn't you, to so far as is reasonably practicable, which might not sound very different. It didn't to me to start with. But when you look at the detail, there's a fundamental change in that, which all of your organisations are going to go away and need to take account of, and you as leaders and your boards are going to really need to be thinking carefully about. And that change is cost. So at the moment when you decide what is something that you can properly put in place as a control to address a hazard, the amount that you're going to have to spend is something that you can take into account, just as important as how bad the consequences might be, or how many people might be going to be affected. That's not going to be the position from next year under the new law. The new law is very clear that cost is only going to come into the picture if it's grossly disproportionate to the risk. Now you might be sitting there thinking, well, what's grossly disproportionate? I have no idea. Why would the new Act tell us that when it's such a critical concept? That would be too easy. Instead, lawyers like me will have to work it out through the courts over the coming years to get some guidance. What I can say to you though, and Gordon will perhaps back this up when he speaks later on, is that WorkSafe's view is likely to be that when the risk is of fatal harm and of killing somebody in your workplaces, that no cost is going to be disproportionate to that, not grossly. So unless it's a really off-the-wall cost, you need to be thinking about making the investment in keeping people safe. And I've heard some people, including the former Minister of Labour, say, look, this is kind of a business as usual law reform. What I do urge all of you is to don't treat it as that. This isn't a compliance exercise. This is actually a really chance for all of you to exercise some leadership and use it as a motivator to get your businesses looking afresh at how we deal with health and safety. I mean, you're all here because you get it. There's lots of CEOs of organisations who aren't here because they don't, but you're in this room because you understand we can do better. And I think that this change is one that you can really look to actually making improvements in your organisations. And the reason I think it's fundamental is because if you think at the moment, you'll have all sorts of controls in your organisations where you've identified a hazard and you've thought through the consequences of what might happen and how you can go about resolving it, and you've made decisions. How confident are each of you that cost hasn't been a factor in some of those decisions? I'd wager that for a fair few of you, cost has been a consideration in some cases, and if it has, you now need to go back and think about that afresh. Because if it's not grossly disproportionate, you need to open the checkbook and start changing your controls. And there's no grace period when this new law comes in, which means that WorkSafe can, I don't think they will, but they could, expect you from day one to have new things in place. And I'll just give you an example about that from a business that I was involved with, where we'd identified a range of problems with a manufacturing facility. They had a particular focus on guarding. We got somebody in to talk to us about guarding and say, right, here's the range of things that we need to do. It's going to cost a lot of money. No surprise there. What do? Let's prioritise the work. We'll put a capital expenditure program in place. We need to facilitate that around actually continuing to operate the business and spending money as it's available. So we'll prioritise things in order we need to deal with them and work our way down the list. That seems pretty sensible to me. Sod's law. one of the low priority things came to pass and somebody was injured at work, lost a finger. That business was prosecuted over that decision-making chain. Well, going forward, the cost isn't grossly disproportionate, you have to deal with it now. Saying, well, it doesn't quite fit our plans, what we're looking to return to our shareholders, doesn't matter. You need to be getting on. Dealing with that when you come to your budget setting, and actually when you're engaging with your boards around why budgets are what they are, I'd expect that you'd be being tested on, are we spending enough on health and safety? What are our workers saying? Are they saying that they're getting everything that they need? There'll be a lot of pushback around this if the law is applied widely. And for myself, I'm not here to tell you, go for the narrow view, spend as little as you can. This is a chance for us actually to make a difference, and so take it, step up to it and actually look to make those investments to keep everybody safe. Next one, just to touch on this duty to consult, cooperate and coordinate activities. That's really an inter-PCBU duty. So the expectation is, going forward, that when you're involved with multiple PCBUs in one site, and if we take, say, Pike River as an example, you had Pike River Coal there running the show, but there were literally dozens of contracting businesses working in that mine. And a lot of them would have had a direct relationship with Pike, and they would have been talking to Pike about what they were doing, but none of those other PCBUs were talking to each other because they didn't need to. Often the same in construction. If you get a big building project, a lot of the Christchurch rebuild stuff, you'll have a chain down from the head contractor to the subbie to another subbie, but different subbies aren't talking to each other. Well, this new law is going to say, to the extent that actually you're influencing each other and you might cause harm to each other, you need to be talking. So think about, within your organisations, actually broadening out what you're doing to involve all of those workers, engaging them with your systems, and making sure that you're doing enough to make sure that all the risks are being identified, you know who's going to do what to take account of them, and people are doing what they say they should be doing. And then the last one for me, just to touch on briefly for all you this afternoon, is officers and due diligence. And I suspect that many of you will know that this is coming. It seems to be quite a hot topic around board tables at the moment. This new law is really a recognition that the existing approach we have of saying, as leaders, you're only responsible if you directly know that something bad is going on. It simply doesn't work. You look at Pike River, it's a great example where Peter Whittle was prosecuted and the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment ultimately pulled that prosecution because they were going to struggle to prove it. And there's a whole range of reasons for that, and it's being challenged now by judicial review, supported by Helen and the CTU. But for whatever reason, the regulator didn't feel that they were going to be able to do enough to prove that Peter Whittle knew enough to get him prosecuted, even though we all know, and the Royal Commission confirmed, that as an organisation, Pike River Coal wasn't doing enough. This new law is saying, right, let's just throw that out completely. That isn't working. It isn't delivering those safer outcomes that we're all here trying to achieve. Let's go instead and flip it on its head and say, for all of you, for all the directors, partners and partnerships, and other people who are actually exercising substantial control over a business, we're going to give you a direct personal obligation to say you have to satisfy yourself that your organisation understands the risks that it's facing, that you have the right systems to address and manage those risks, that it's working effectively, that it's resourced effectively, and that people have been given the best chance to go home safely. That is going to be another fundamental change for all of you in this room to get to grips with by next year. Because you might think that you're doing enough now, but I suspect that if an inspector from WorkSafe came into your office tomorrow morning and said, right, talk me through what's going on with health and safety in your organisation, how satisfied are you that you'd be able to demonstrate to the inspector, not just taking your word for it, but actually prove to the inspector that you knew, for example, what the 10 most critical risks are in your organisation, that you know what the controls are around those 10 risks, that you know that actually those controls are working, and that the workers are saying that they've had enough resource and support, whether that be money, people, plant and equipment, to make sure that they're being given that opportunity to go home safely. There's a lot for you and your boards to be thinking about in terms of preparing plans to protect you against that sort of stuff. But just to step out of the scary detail around it for a minute, the good news is it seems to work in Australia. It's still early days over there, but I'm aware that there's research being done by Macquarie University, and what they're finding in Australia is that actually having this due diligence obligation is providing additional motivation to get leaders understanding more about what's going on, and we're seeing safer workplaces. That's what it's all about for me, and that's really the challenge for you with this new law, to take the process and the compliance around it and actually make sure that you actually deliver safer workplaces.
I'll have a leave it there and let you get on.